Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and this is RegWatch by RegulatorWatch.com. The FDA's anti-vaping regime, once thought untouchable, is demonstrably being dismantled. As we reported last week, the Trump administration gutted the FDA and CDC, executing mass layoffs, shuttering offices, and removing Brian King as director of the Center for Tobacco Products. It's not been pretty, but the bureaucratic fortress that led the war on vaping has been rocked to its core. The FDA's Office of Regulations, gone. The Office of Management, gone. The FDA's entire media team, gone. And at the CDC, the long-standing Office on Smoking and Health, also gone. Is this chaos or the reform many in the U.S. vaping industry have been calling for? Joining us today to help answer that question is Tony Abboud, Executive Director of the Vapor Technology Association, one of the few people who's been in the trenches fighting for reform where it matters most, inside the Beltway. Tony, it's great to see you, and thanks for coming back on the show.
Thank you, Brent. I appreciate you having me back on.
Well, Tony, the FDA and CDC just lost thousands of staff. Key offices were shuttered. Is this chaos or something more deliberate, maybe controlled demolition?
You were right at the outset. Brian King is out, right? And so we believe this signals a major shift in the agency's approach to both vaping and nicotine regulation. And one reason is because he led the fight against flavored vaping. He was against flavored vaping when he was at CDC. Before he came to FDA. There was some hope that as an actual regulator at FDA, he would do what they are supposed to do, which is call balls and strikes. That did not happen. So I don't think that just his removal is what is significant. What is significant is the fact that the Trump administration has taken a pretty big hammer to the Center for Tobacco Products in the ways that you mentioned, and even in some others. And I think what it's doing, it is signaling that this is the Trump administration's first material and significant step towards significant reform in terms of our healthcare policies, particularly as it relates to tobacco regulation.
So you think, and the question being, is this actually the start, the beginning of Trump actually saving vaping in the U.S.?
Well, I would think so. As what you're alluding to, I believe, is the promise that the president made on Truth Social back in September. I think what has become clear from all stakeholders in this industry is that the Center for Tobacco Products is broken, that the regulation itself is broken, that it is not netting the ultimate result that it was supposed to have, which is getting less harmful nicotine products into the marketplace as an alternative to cigarettes. The record that we've seen over the last 4 years is just abysmal. And so the clearest way to clear the way to make reforms is to make sure that the people who misused the regulation and stood in the way of less harmful tobacco products are gone. So yes, I do believe it is the first step of further action, which is to come.
So let's broaden this out a little bit for those in our audience that might not be familiar with the Center for Tobacco Products. What exactly was their mandate? Is their mandate still? And how are they funded? Because I think that's pretty interesting.
The Center for Tobacco Products is funded exclusively from what are called user fees that are paid by the tobacco industry. They have a set amount, which is about approximately $711 million that they get every year. They get those funds regardless of how they perform. They get those funds without any sort of accountability to Congress or, frankly, any other body, and certainly with no accountability to industry. Ultimately, the goal of the Center for Tobacco Products was to implement the various provisions of the Tobacco Control Act that was passed in 2009. And so we've heard from CTP over the last 4 years that they are a young center, that they are in their adolescence, so to speak. But the reality is that they have had the manpower, the funding, and the resources to do the job that they were supposed to do, but they just have chosen not to do it. One of the principal things that they are supposed to do is to review applications for tobacco products under the PMTA process. And while they kind of reviewed a large number of applications, we now know from various court filings and admissions of the agency that they really did not do their job. And that is what has left us as an industry here in the United States with what I've called before a hot mess.
So describe to us what the agenda has been at the CTP with regard to nicotine vaping products that's left the industry in such peril.
Well, very fundamentally, both Director King and FDA Commissioner Califf have steadfastly refused to authorize flavored vaping products, plain and simple. They had a belief that flavored vaping products were somehow not appropriate, and therefore they devised a scheme to make sure that they were not authorized. I mean, look, when you get 27 million applications and you authorized basically only 2 products that have only one flavor and they're from one company, I mean, this is not the way the system should be working. And when you do so by constantly repeating tropes about the industry, tropes about the product, such as they're dangerous, such as they're foreign made, such as they're appealing to children, when you know that the data and the facts don't support that, that just kind of shows you some of the tools that were used to justify their actions to keep flavored vaping products out of the hands of responsible adults.
Talk a bit more about the kind of demolition that's happened here at the agencies, because it literally is thousands of people across, key areas.
Well, I think President Trump and Secretary Kennedy have made it very clear that they are looking to change the way in which our public health agencies have been operating. I think that they have acknowledged that the public health agencies in over the last 4 years have not been completely transparent with the American people, frankly, have not been truthful to the American people. And they have cited many examples of that. We know very well, as it relates to e-cigarettes, the Center for Tobacco Products and the FDA have been anything but truthful about the relative harm associated with cigarettes, which will kill you most of the time, compared to vaping products or, frankly, other less harmful forms of nicotine products. So when an agency head or a center head is constantly telling the American people that no tobacco product is safe, and yet they are sitting on millions or thousands of applications which could offer the American public a product which is dramatically less harmful than smoking a cigarette, and they don't do that, that tells you that there is an agenda. And I think that this administration has been very clear. They do not believe in regulations that are being used by unelected bureaucrats, in some cases written by unelected bureaucrats, in most cases, where there is no clear statutory authority, being used in a manner to quash innovation, to crush industry, and to perpetuate falsehoods to the American public.
Now, it's interesting that you mentioned that because, of course, the entire media team at the FDA got axed. And they're going to have to put some new media people back in there at some point. And that says to me something about just the thoroughness of this house cleaning, is that, the shills for this type of ideology are being axed. And boy, if you put the right people in there, they don't need to be, communicating on behalf of the U.S. vaping industry in some manner that's not science-based, but just put some people in there that have got some viewpoints that might not be so, regulated by Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids?
Well, we have never wanted the government to speak on behalf of industry. That is not their role, and no one should want that. By the same token, government should not be speaking on behalf of other special interest groups that have spent millions of dollars lobbying for their own agenda. And in this case, this CTP and FDA have entered into financial arrangements. They've entered into contracts with these various groups. They've called them preferred partners, as if they were aligned. Well, they were aligned in terms of their political view of the world, in their view of being all things anti-tobacco and all things anti-nicotine. But that is not the job of a regulator. The regulator is supposed to enforce the law. The regulator is supposed to enforce a lawful regulation and accurately and honestly interpret the scientific information that companies spent millions of dollars to submit. But that just did not happen over the course of the last 4 years. And that is why we still have tens of thousands, if not millions of products still awaiting a decision by the FDA. They could have made decisions, they just chose not to do so.
If you could sum up what happened for us with the SCOTUS decision last week.
This was a Supreme Court decision. They had granted certiorari to the FDA, who had appealed the Fifth Circuit's decision, which lambasted the FDA for the manner in which it was implementing what the Fifth Circuit called a de facto ban on flavored e-cigarettes. Now, as you know, with most court cases, so much turns on the interpretation of the statute, the arguments that are presented, and all of the facts that are presented. In this case, there's no question that the Supreme Court was very skeptical about some of the actions that were taken by the agency. But at the end of the day, they determined that the agency had enough discretion to kind of assess what it was doing as it was doing it and change its process as it went along. That was one of the core arguments against what the agency had done. And the court literally came down on the side of an agency being able to implement its decision-making process the way that it wanted to. Now, the case itself ultimately is not over because the the Supreme Court also remanded a significant issue that was not that FDA did ask them not to address, and it remanded that issue back to the Fifth Circuit. So in this case, there will be more proceedings at the Fifth Circuit, and depending upon how the Fifth Circuit rules, this case may come back up again to the Supreme Court.
Now, many were hoping that the U.S. Supreme Court would take this opportunity to really gut kind of the regulatory management process that the FDA had. I mean, we talked about Chenery and Loper and a bunch of other names that were out there in terms of decisions prior that could have impacted this. And SCOTUS chose not to go down that road.
Yeah, I mean, importantly, the Loper-Bright decision, which last year dramatically altered the type of discretion that a court would allow to an executive agency, was not at issue in this case. The issues in this case were set and briefed before that decision came down. And it is, I think, important to note that not once did the court cite to Loper or mention it in any way in its opinion, which really means that the fundamental questions about how this regulation would be viewed if a Loper argument was made were not addressed by the court. And that's what I said at the outset. This case was narrowly decided on the very specific issues before the court. Now, we had raised the fact that Loper, in an amicus brief, that through the prism of Loper, the court should look more skeptically on the agency's actions. But I think the court is either going to engage in that discussion or it's not. And because it wasn't presented by the parties, it was not an issue in this particular decision.
Tony, over the last few years, Director King authorized onto the market hundreds of new cigarettes and cigars while letting vape products die on the vine. From your vantage point, what's been the net impact then of those actions?
Well, they're just bad for public health. It makes no sense at all when the agency is supposedly executing the mission of ending smoking. And you have a situation where before Brian King arrived at FDA and CTP, the Biden FDA had authorized, a number of combustible tobacco products, but only 4% of those were cigarettes. After Brian King arrived, that percentage jumped to 54 or 53%. So in other words, of all the combustible tobacco products that were authorized when Brian King was in charge, 53% of them were cigarettes, a total of 783 new cigarettes, which dwarfs the number of less harmful vaping products that were authorized. I mean, what does that mean for consumers? That means that the options that FDA is willing to provide them are combustible, the ones that will ultimately kill them. And so it really begs the question as to what's going on. Like, how does one consider himself to be a regulator and looking out to protect public health, but fast tracks to market hundreds and hundreds of cigarettes and ensures that less harmful products stay off of the market? And you combine that lack of authorization with also the efforts to remove as many products from the market, i.e. to implement a ban, particularly on flavored vaping products. And again, it kind of spells out an agenda. And public health agencies in particular cannot be run by individuals that have agenda like these.
Many guests on this show, including Clive Bates, has pointed out that the actions that CTP has taken over the years, it pretty much amounts to the Big Tobacco Protection Agency.
Whether it's intentional or that's just the way it worked out, that is effectively what's been happening. And one of the points is that each time we saw that cigarette companies raised concerns to the agency about anything going on in the marketplace, Brian King was quick to act. He was quick to jump to their aid. I mean, put aside the fact that the only products that FDA has authorized are those that are owned by the cigarette companies. You see these policy decisions being implemented. The enforcement scheme of the last year has been one of those. And it's just astonishing because when everyone in the industry was critical of the PMTA process, the FDA's inability to properly execute that process, the denial after denial after denial of PMTA applications, it was really stunning to watch the agency pivot with some support from industry stakeholders to saying, okay, even though you thought that process was bad and broken, and some are still litigating it and the legality of those decisions, the FDA then just turned around and said, we're going to enforce as aggressively as possible all of these illegal decisions. And I think, frankly, over the last year and a half or so, that's given FDA breathing room, because now it can say, oh, look at us, we're enforcing. But that's taken the eye off the ball. The problem was with the process in the first place. The problem was with the regulation in the first place. And so I think in the public discourse, with all the discussion of enforcement, we've lost sight of the fact that the process was broken, the regulation was broken, and in effect, Brian King, FDA, they got a pass. I mean, don't forget the Reagan-Udall Foundation, which was an independent external review requested by the FDA commissioner himself, and which took place right when Brian King was coming into power. They reviewed the process and said that the agency is not clear with industry. It hasn't clearly articulated what is required for a PMTA, and it certainly has not articulated what and how the agency is interpreting and applying the public health standard. And they told the agency, you need a strategic plan now that addresses these issues. And what did FDA and Brian King do? They waited a whole year while another 480,000 Americans died from smoking cigarettes. And then they put out the classic bureaucratic stack of paper that never addressed the core criticisms. So when the process is broken, and in the process, they said, oh, we're going to focus more on enforcing this broken regulation that even the Reagan-Udall Foundation said lack the clarity that's necessary to be run effectively. So that is at the core of the problem, and we have to get back to how do we fix the broken regulation and the broken process. I think all industry is hopeful that the agency can make better decisions, quicker decisions. I mean, what we do know, and another data point for proof that the PMTA regulation itself is broken, is that FDA was never able to meet its statutory requirement of making a decision within 180 days. One can argue that if you look at that part of the statute and you look at the regulation that was put in place, that was never what was intended under the Tobacco Control Act. I mean, how can you fashion a regulation that is so onerous and so burdensome and so opaque that the agency cannot, that created that regulation cannot even implement it according to the law? There are just so many different layers, Brent, upon which the regulation itself and the process is broken. And that is why we believe that the administration, consistent with the manner in which it is approaching all regulations, will look very skeptically at this process and think that it should continue to be carried out just by another individual.
So, Tony, as you mentioned, President Trump had actually promised to save vaping back in September of last year during the campaign, but he had actually made that promise before. He's made it twice. Once was in late 2019 when he promised to save vaping, and again, obviously, just during the last presidential election. What's different today than when he made the promise back in 2019?
Well, in 2019, he didn't just promise, he acted. At the time, he was being asked to ban all flavored vaping products by his FDA.
Well, this is a very big subject, and it's a very complex subject, probably a little bit less complex than some people think, but I'm here to listen, and I have very divergent views.
Mr. President, I'm Senator Mitt Romney. Myself and Senator Merkley have offered legislation that is very consistent with your policy from September, your discussion in September, which is to ban flavors.
There are very large e-cigarette companies at this table, but most of the members of our trade association are small mom and pop shops. They're small manufacturers, they're small businesses that have built this industry from the ground up, not from the top down.
So what do you say?
And we say you have to implement, as you said, this is a complex problem, so you need a sophisticated plan. A flavor ban will not work, and you've articulated one critical reason why it will not work. People will just go to the black market, and that's because adults are demanding these flavors.
But doesn't that happen? Let's say okay, you just ended your flavors, right?
Before flavors were marketed so heavily, candidly, by Juul, the number one flavor e-cigarette on the market was tobacco flavor. We're not talking about removing all e-cigarettes. What we're talking about doing is removing the flavors that have fueled the epidemic among our kids.
I understand what you're saying, Matthew. I'm saying this. If we take out flavors, won't they just be made illegally?
You know,
The
it's
same
interesting.
flavor, but maybe unsafe.
When we met back then, we made it clear to the president that that was the wrong decision, that flavored vaping products play an incredibly important role with adults trying to quit smoking, and that if you want to protect youth, we should raise the age to 21. And that is what the president did. In lieu of banning all flavored vaping products, he did end up targeting the pod and cartridge systems and said that those flavors would be banned. But by then, most of the big companies had already pulled their flavors off of the market. But he did three things. The first thing he did was exempt from that flavor ban open systems. He exempted from that flavor ban disposable products, which are closed system products. And then he moved to raise the age to 21, as we had been vigorously advocating. And since then, I think you already know the stats, but I'll repeat them. The youth vaping rate in this country has dropped 71%, even with the proliferation of numerous flavored vaping products, whether they be open systems or disposables, on the market. So now we know from 5 years of empirical data that there can be and is no real relationship between the existence of flavored vaping products on the market and youth usage, because as flavored vaping products have increased in the market, youth vaping has plummeted. Now, that was what he did back then. But what happened in the ensuing 4 years was that the Biden administration came in and started to use its regulatory power in the ways that we were discussing earlier to get rid of all flavored vaping products. And so now we sit at a similar precipice as where we were in 2019. And the president, as you said he is going to save flavored vaping again. The difference now is he can do it once and for all, do it in a way that would prevent a future administration from coming back in and unwinding that work. And that is the opportunity that the administration has before it right now.
How do you see that he'd be able to do that? What provisions could be done to protect the industry from future administrations?
Well, there are two paths. One is Congress can change the statute, but that is fraught with all kinds of problems. Opening the Tobacco Control Act, you'd have every stakeholder group that's out there jostling and fighting and lobbying and doing all of their thing. And that will take some time. The biggest thing that he can do is provide such clarity for the U.S. vaping industry so that all of these questions about that have been raised by the malfeasance of the last administration can be resolved. If we have a regulatory process that's transparent, that's objective, that keeps the regulator himself from imposing his or her own views. In other words, a process that is truly driven by the science, where the science makes the decision, is the way to secure the future. And doing so in an aggressive way will also bring order to the market. Right now, we have disorder in the marketplace because of what the Biden FDA has been doing. And to restore regulated order to the marketplace, that can only be done through precise clarity in the regulation itself, or more specifically, in the FDA's expectations of what is required to meet that public health standard. Companies throughout this country are more than willing and more than able, and in fact, they have been trying over many years to get products approved. But it's not a function of money, because to date, it doesn't matter whether you've spent $1 million for each product or $100 million. The FDA has effectively said no to just about everything. So providing that clarity to the marketplace then will allow a plethora of products to be in the marketplace where they can then fight it out. That's the ultimate goal here from our perspective. We need to have companies fighting in the marketplace for superiority, because that gives the American consumer the best options to choose from, and the American consumer will always decide. The smoker, the vapor will always be the ultimate arbiter of what sells and what doesn't sell. And right now, we had, up until recently, a group of people, unelected, deciding for the American people, these are the small handful of products that you get to purchase legally, and we're going to declare everything else that we have not yet approved as illegal. And so when the FDA declares that the entire marketplace, with the exception of the dozen or so devices, 34, applications in all, when it declares that everything but those are illegal, then the marketplace is completely confused and completely at the whim of others. The biggest fear is bans don't work. Everybody knows bans don't work. It is not a principle, I believe, that this administration believes in. And to the extent that the Biden administration was having success in implementing its ban, it was just crushing American businesses who built their business on selling less harmful flavored vaping products.
Tony, just last month, VTA launched a broadcast television campaign calling on President Trump to keep his promise to save flavored vaping. I've got the ad right here. Let's take a listen.
President Trump, we kept our promise and delivered hundreds of thousands of votes to Trump across this great country. But now, Big Tobacco is using scare tactics to get you to break your promise to your voters. American lives, small businesses, and a $17 billion industry to end smoking are all on the line. President Trump, we are counting on you. The signs are clear. Keep your promise to save the flavored vaping industry.
So, Tony, what are you hoping to get out of this campaign?
Well, the president stepped into just a colossal mess, and he has acted with decisiveness on so many issues. And then new issues, as with any president, continue to arise. One of the objectives that we have is continuing to raise awareness of the importance of this issue, because the president says, promises made, promises kept. But we know in the reality of the day-to-day and all of the issues that confront the White House, that this is not on the top of the list. And so our objective is to remind the administration of where they've been, where we've been, and how we've supported. And this is one way of doing that. You know what, Brent? It's important to remind folks what the U.S. vaping industry is all about. We are an industry that grew from the ground up, not the big corporations down. We are an industry of individual small business owners that built their businesses in large part because they found a product, an e-cigarette, that helped them quit smoking for the first time after everything else, including the FDA's products, failed. And we've built an industry of manufacturers, wholesalers, distributors, suppliers, and brick and mortar retailers and online retailers in this country that every day are competing with cigarettes, that every day are trying to make sure that their customers have access to less harmful products that will help them get away from smoking cigarettes. Now, what is stunning to me is the way many states, particularly red states, have taken up these calls to enforce and shut down these small businesses. How red states have decided to adopt these misguided policies and this flavored vaping ban agenda of the Biden administration and ensconce that into state law. One of the reasons why the president's action on this issue will be demonstrative is because it will say the path of the future of the past is definitely not the path of the future. And the future for the US vaping industry is all about being able to offer its customers, adult consumers who are trying to get off of cigarettes, less harmful nicotine options, whether it's vaping products or pouches. Once this regulation is clarified, we will see a surge in this country of development, of innovation, of jobs that will be unlike anything. The marketplace is too big to be ignored.